The morning sun cast long shadows through the stained glass windows of St. Mary's Lutheran Church in Benton County, Iowa. Margaret Henderson, 78, unlocked the heavy wooden doors for what she didn't know would be the last time. The sanctuary that once held 200 worshipers every Sunday now echoed with the footsteps of just 12 faithful congregants. By Christmas of that year, those doors would be padlocked forever, and the building would join the growing list of abandoned churches dotting America's rural landscape like forgotten tombstones. What Margaret experienced that final Sunday morning is happening across rural America at an unprecedented rate. Every week, between 3 and 4 rural churches close their doors permanently. That's not just a statistic. That's the death of communities, the end of centuries-old traditions, and the erasure of spiritual anchors that once held entire towns together. But here's what most people don't understand. This isn't really a story about declining faith. It's a story about economics, demographics, and a perfect storm of forces that have been building for decades. The real reasons these sacred spaces are disappearing will surprise you, anger you, and perhaps change how you see the future of rural America entirely. Let's start with a number that should shock you. Since 2010, more than 4,500 rural churches have permanently closed across the United States. To put that in perspective, that's roughly one church closing every single day for the past 13 years. In some counties, particularly in the Great Plains states, the closure rate approaches 40% of all rural congregations. Take Nebraska, for instance. In 1950, the state had 1,047 rural churches serving farming communities. Today, fewer than 800 remain active. The Methodist Church alone has lost 65% of its rural congregations in the state since 1980. These aren't just buildings, though they're the heart of communities that are bleeding out, one closed door at a time. The story of rural church decline begins not in the sanctuary, but in the farmyard. In 1935, there were 6.8 million farms in America. Today, there are just 2.0 million, despite the fact that those remaining farms are producing more food than ever before. Modern agricultural technology means that where it once took 100 families to farm a section of land, now it takes perhaps 3 or 4. The young people who might have stayed to inherit the family farm are instead heading to cities where economic opportunities await. Consider the case of Matfield Green, Kansas, a town that once boasted 400 residents and 3 active churches. Today, the population hovers around 47 people, with an average age of 58. The Methodist Church closed in 1998, the Catholic Church in 2003, and the Lutheran Church is hanging on with just 8 regular attendees, all over the age of 70. When those 8 people are gone, so too will be the last church in a town that once had enough faith to sustain 3 congregations. But population decline alone doesn't explain the scope of this crisis. After all, many rural churches have weathered lean times before. What's different now is the combination of factors creating what researchers call a congregational death spiral. The first domino to fall is often financial. Rural churches, unlike their urban counterparts, typically depend on a small number of major donors. In farming communities, this might be 3 or 4 families who contribute 60 to 70% of the annual budget. When those families move away, sell their farms, or face economic hardship, the church's finances collapse almost overnight. The numbers are stark. The average rural church budget is $85,000 per year, with 65% of that going to pastoral salaries and building maintenance. Many rural churches operate on budgets of $40,000 or less, making it impossible to retain full-time pastors. This creates a vicious cycle. Without professional pastoral leadership, congregations shrink further, reducing donations and making the financial situation even more dire. Father Michael Torres experienced this firsthand when he arrived at St. Patrick's Catholic Church in rural Montana in 2019. The previous pastor had been serving 4 different parishes, driving 180 miles every Sunday to conduct services. The congregation had dwindled to 23 regular attendees, and the church's roof was literally falling in. The diocese was spending $3,200 per month to maintain a building that was generating just $800 in monthly donations. I realized I wasn't just a priest. Torres recalls. I was a hospice worker, helping a dying congregation find peace before the end. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Professor Archive, where we dig deep into the stories that shape our world. I'm your host, and today we're exploring one of the most profound but overlooked transformations happening in America today. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you watching from, and what's your profession? Are you perhaps someone who's witnessed this transformation firsthand? Drop a comment and let me know. The generational divide represents perhaps the most insurmountable challenge facing rural churches. Across all denominations, rural congregations are aging at twice the rate of urban churches. The median age of rural church members is 58, compared to 42 in suburban churches and 39 in urban congregations. More troubling still, only 12% of rural church members are under the age of 35. This isn't simply about young people rejecting religion. Polling data shows that rural young adults are actually more likely to identify as Christian than their urban counterparts. The problem is retention. Young people leave rural areas for education and employment opportunities, and they rarely return. Even when they do come back, they often find churches that feel frozen in time, resistant to change, and disconnected from their contemporary spiritual needs. Sarah Chen, a sociologist at the University of Nebraska who has studied rural church decline for 15 years, puts it bluntly. We're witnessing the natural death of institutions that were built for a world that no longer exists. These churches were designed for stable, multi-generational farming communities, where families stayed in the same place for decades. That world is gone. The data supports Chen's assessment. In 1950, the average American lived in the same county their entire life. Today, the average American moves 11 times, with rural young adults being the most mobile demographic of all. Churches built on the assumption of generational continuity simply cannot adapt to this new reality. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of rural church decline is what happens to the buildings themselves. Unlike urban churches, which might be converted to community centers, restaurants, or cultural venues, rural churches often have no viable second life. The buildings are typically too large for the remaining population to maintain, too expensive to heat and cool, and too specialized in their design for easy conversion. In Iowa alone, more than 200 former church buildings now sit empty, slowly deteriorating. Some have been converted to antique stores or event venues, but many simply rot away, their stained glass windows broken, their steeples home to birds and bats. The state spends approximately $2.3 million annually just on the demolition of abandoned rural churches that have become safety hazards. The story of Trinity Methodist Church in Franklin County, Iowa, illustrates this tragic trajectory. Built in 1889 with beautiful hardwood pews and hand-painted ceiling frescoes, the church served the community for 127 years. When it closed in 2016, the congregation couldn't afford the $120,000 needed for basic roof repairs. Local preservationists tried to save the building, but the cost of restoration exceeded $400,000. Money that simply wasn't available in a county where the median household income is $44,000. Today, Trinity Methodist sits empty, its doors chained shut, its cemetery the only sign that a community once gathered there in faith and fellowship. The building that once anchored a thriving rural community is now just another statistic in the collapse of rural America's social infrastructure. The ripple effects of church closures extend far beyond matters of faith. Rural churches have historically served as community centers, hosting everything from town halls to wedding receptions. They've provided emergency shelter during natural disasters, coordinated charitable activities, and served as the social glue that held small communities together. When First Baptist Church in Greenville, Alabama, closed its doors in 2018, the town lost more than a place of worship. The church had been the primary polling location for 3 precincts, the meeting place for the local historical society, and the organizer of the annual community Christmas celebration. The church's food pantry, which served 45 families monthly, disappeared overnight. The volunteer fire department, which had used the church basement for equipment storage, suddenly had nowhere to house their gear. When the church died, the heart of our town died with it, says former Mayor Robert Hill. We're still trying to figure out how to rebuild that sense of community, but it's like trying to restart a heart that's already stopped beating. The economic impact goes beyond sentiment. A study by the Rural Church Network found that rural church closures reduce local property values by an average of 8% within a 2-mile radius. The loss of weekly gatherings means fewer people shopping at local businesses. The elimination of church-sponsored events removes tourist attractions that might have brought outside visitors to struggling communities. In some cases, entire downtowns have essentially died following church closures. The loss of Sunday morning foot traffic means cafes and restaurants lose a crucial revenue source. The absence of wedding and funeral gatherings eliminates business for florists, caterers, and hotels. Some economists estimate that each rural church closure costs the local economy between $250,000 and $400,000 annually in lost economic activity. Yet amid this story of decline and loss, there are remarkable examples of adaptation and resilience. Some rural churches are finding innovative ways to survive and even thrive in changing circumstances. The Prairie View Methodist Circuit in South Dakota represents one such success story. Rather than watching individual congregations slowly die, 5 small churches decided to formally merge their resources while maintaining separate locations. They share a single pastor, combine their budgets, and rotate major events between locations. The arrangement has allowed all 5 churches to remain open, maintain their buildings, and even launch new programming. Pastor Jennifer Holbrook, who serves the circuit, explains the model. Instead of 5 dying churches, we have one healthy church that meets in 5 different places. It's changed everything about how we think about rural ministry. Other churches are embracing technology to expand their reach beyond geographic limitations. Riverside Baptist Church in rural Kentucky live streams its services to former members who moved away, creating a virtual congregation of 200 people who participate online. These remote members contribute financially to the church and even participate in virtual prayer meetings and Bible studies. The church has also partnered with congregations in urban areas, creating a sister church relationship that provides both financial support and volunteer assistance for major projects. Urban church members have traveled to Kentucky to help with building maintenance, while the rural church provides agricultural products for urban food pantries. Some denominations are experimenting with radical restructuring to address the crisis. The United Methodist Church has launched its Fresh Expressions initiative, which plants new forms of church in rural areas, meeting in coffee shops, community centers, and even farm supply stores. These new congregations abandon traditional Sunday morning worship in favor of flexible gathering times that work with agricultural schedules. The Lutheran Church Missouri Synod has created bivocational pastor programs, training ministers who can serve small congregations while maintaining other careers. These pastors might be farmers, teachers, or business owners who provide spiritual leadership on a part-time basis, dramatically reducing the financial burden on small congregations. But perhaps the most innovative approach comes from an unexpected source: the Catholic Church. Facing priest shortages and church closures across rural America, some dioceses are experimenting with ecclesial communities, lay-led congregations that maintain Catholic identity and practice without full-time priests. These communities gather for prayer services, religious education, and social activities, with priests visiting monthly for Mass and sacraments. The success of these alternative models raises provocative questions about the future of rural faith communities. If churches can maintain spiritual and social functions without traditional building-based congregations, what does that mean for the hundreds of abandoned church buildings dotting rural America? Some communities are finding creative answers. In Minnesota, the town of Starbuck converted its former Methodist church into a community performing arts center. The sanctuary's excellent acoustics make it perfect for concerts and theatrical performances, while the fellowship hall hosts community dinners and meetings. The building's spiritual heritage is honored through memorial gardens and historical displays, but its function has evolved to meet contemporary community needs. Other former churches have become libraries, daycare centers, and even craft breweries. While some find such conversions sacrilegious, others see them as breathing new life into buildings that might otherwise crumble to dust. The theological implications of rural church decline extend beyond practical concerns about buildings and budgets. For many Americans, small rural churches represent the authentic heart of Christian faith, places where community, tradition, and spiritual practice intersect in ways that larger urban churches cannot replicate. Dr. Regina Webb, a theology professor at Kansas State University who grew up in rural Kansas, argues that the loss of these churches represents a fundamental shift in American Christianity. Rural churches historically emphasized community over individual spirituality, she explains. They were places where faith was lived out through mutual support, shared hardship, and collective celebration. As we lose these institutions, we're losing a particular way of being Christian that has deep historical roots. The impact on rural clergy has been particularly devastating. Many pastors who dedicated their lives to rural ministry find themselves presiding over dying congregations, forced to make impossible decisions about which programs to cut and which buildings to abandon. The psychological toll is enormous, with rural pastors experiencing depression and burnout at rates significantly higher than their urban counterparts. Reverend David Martinez served rural Methodist churches in Nebraska for 35 years before retiring early due to what he calls compassion fatigue. During his final decade of ministry, he closed 7 churches and presided over the consolidation of 3 others. I became a minister to nurture life and growth, Martinez reflects. Instead, I spent my career as an undertaker helping churches die with dignity. That's not what I signed up for, and it nearly broke my spirit. The broader implications of rural church decline extend to American politics and social cohesion. Rural churches have historically served as training grounds for civic leadership, with church boards and committees preparing community members for roles in local government, school boards, and volunteer organizations. As these institutions disappear, rural areas are experiencing what political scientists call a civic capacity crisis. Research by the University of Nebraska's Center for Rural Affairs shows that counties with higher rates of church closure also experience decreased voter turnout, fewer candidates for local office, and reduced participation in community organizations. The correlation isn't necessarily causal, but it suggests that churches serve functions far beyond spiritual guidance. The loss of rural churches also has implications for American religious diversity. Small rural churches often maintained distinct theological traditions and worship styles that differed significantly from mainstream denominational practices. As these congregations disappear, American Christianity becomes more homogenized, with suburban megachurches and urban progressive congregations dominating the landscape. Some traditions may disappear entirely. The German Lutheran churches of rural Wisconsin, for instance, maintained unique hymns, prayer traditions, and seasonal celebrations that trace their roots to 19th century immigrant communities. As these churches close, centuries-old religious practices are being lost forever. The environmental impact of church closures deserves attention as well. Many rural churches were built with old-growth timber and crafted using traditional techniques that are no longer economically viable. The architectural heritage represented by these buildings is irreplaceable, yet preservation is often financially impossible for struggling rural communities. The stained glass windows alone in America's abandoned rural churches represent millions of dollars in artistic value. Much of this glass was created by renowned artisans in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but without climate-controlled environments and regular maintenance, these treasures are deteriorating rapidly. Some preservationists are racing to salvage what they can. The National Trust for Historic Preservation has launched a rural church documentation project, photographing and cataloging architectural details before buildings are demolished. Some stained glass windows have been relocated to museums or active churches, but the vast majority will be lost to time and weather. At this point, I want to pause and ask you something. If you're finding this exploration valuable, if it's giving you new perspectives on changes happening in communities across America, would you consider supporting Professor Archive with a super thanks? Your support helps us continue researching and sharing these important stories that often get overlooked by mainstream media. Looking toward the future, several trends will likely accelerate rural church decline. Climate change is making farming less viable in many traditional agricultural regions, accelerating rural depopulation. The COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated that many rural churches lack the technological infrastructure to adapt to changing circumstances. Most significantly, younger generations show less attachment to specific denominations and more willingness to change churches or abandon organized religion entirely. However, some demographers see potential for rural church revival in unexpected places. As remote work becomes more common, some professionals are choosing to live in rural areas while maintaining urban jobs. These digital nomads often seek community connections and may be drawn to rural churches as sources of social engagement. The growth of agritourism and rural recreation industries is bringing new visitors to previously isolated areas. Some rural churches are adapting to serve these temporary populations, offering services that appeal to weekend visitors and seasonal residents. Additionally, some denominations are experiencing growth in rural areas, particularly evangelical and Pentecostal churches that emphasize contemporary worship styles and practical theology. These congregations often meet in more flexible spaces and operate with volunteer leadership models that traditional denominations are now beginning to adopt. The story of rural church decline is ultimately a story about change, economic, social, and cultural transformations that have reshaped American life over the past century. While the loss of these institutions represents genuine tragedy for many communities, it also demonstrates the resilience and adaptability of faith communities facing existential challenges. Perhaps the most important lesson from this crisis is that religious institutions, like all human organizations, must evolve to survive. The rural churches that are thriving today are those that have found ways to maintain their spiritual mission while adapting to contemporary realities. They've embraced new technologies, experimented with alternative leadership models, and redefined what it means to be a church community. The churches that are closing, by contrast, are often those that assumed the world would remain unchanged, that the farming communities and social structures of the mid-20th century would persist indefinitely. Their failure to adapt doesn't diminish their historical importance or the genuine grief their loss creates, but it does offer lessons for other institutions facing similar challenges. As we've seen, the causes of rural church decline are complex and interconnected. Demographic shifts, economic pressures, generational changes, and cultural evolution. But within this story of loss, we've also found examples of creativity, adaptation, and hope. Some rural churches are finding new ways to serve their communities, building partnerships that transcend geographic boundaries and reimagining what Christian community can look like in the 21st century. The empty churches scattered across rural America tell the story of a nation in transition, of communities grappling with forces beyond their control. But they also remind us that change, even painful change, is a constant in human experience. The question isn't whether rural churches will continue to close. They will. The question is whether the surviving congregations can learn from both the failures and successes we've examined, and whether new forms of rural spiritual community can emerge to meet the needs of changing populations. For Margaret Henderson, the woman we met at the beginning of this story, the closing of St. Mary's Lutheran represented the end of an era. But 6 months later, she and 8 other former members began meeting in her living room for prayer and Bible study. They call themselves the St. Mary's Circle, and while they no longer have a building or a pastor, they continue to find meaning in gathering as a community of faith. Their story suggests that perhaps the most important question isn't whether rural churches will survive in their traditional form, but whether the human need for spiritual community will find new expressions in America's changing rural landscape. The buildings may crumble, the steeples may fall, but the search for meaning, connection, and hope continues in ways that might surprise us all. The real reason rural churches are closing their doors isn't any single factor. It's the confluence of demographic, economic, and cultural forces that have transformed rural America. Understanding these forces helps us see this crisis not as an inevitable tragedy, but as a challenge that requires creative, compassionate responses. The future of rural faith communities depends on their ability to adapt while preserving what matters most. the human connections that give life meaning and purpose. What happens next in this story isn't predetermined. It will be written by the people who choose to stay in rural communities, the leaders who dare to experiment with new models of ministry, and the congregations willing to let go of buildings while holding tight to their faith. In that ongoing story, there may yet be room for hope, even amid the ruins of what once was.